Thank you for your interest in protection information management and your interest in the operational guidance and what it will mean for the management of protection data. We welcome you to this webinar. As a matter of housekeeping, I'd like to ask all participants in this webinar to please mute themselves unless speaking, and to please use the chat for questions along the way. There'll be also an opportunity for questions and answers in the second half of the webinar. I'd like to tell you that the webinar will be recorded. It will be recorded for sharing purposes, and everyone who's registered for this webinar will be receiving a link to the recording after the webinar has concluded. To start us off, why are we having a PIM webinar on the Interagency Standing Committee's operational guidance on data responsibility? Here and after, we'll be referring to it simply for the purpose of this webinar as the operational guidance. As some of those of you who are familiar with the PIM initiative will know, the PIM initiative was started in 2015 and co-led by UNHCR, the Global Protection Cluster, and DRC, with the objective of providing quality data and information on the protection of forcibly displaced persons in a safe, reliable, and meaningful way. This is a shared interest between the PIM initiative and the operational guidance. Both set out to address the need for collective level efforts to advance responsible management of data. And in the case of the PIM initiative, this is specifically for protection outcomes, which is why the focus of today's webinar is on the operational guidance potential for positively shaping the protection actors' safe, ethical, and effective management of data in a humanitarian response. So specifically looking at the operational guidance from a protection perspective. We are, from the perspective of the PIM initiative, very pleased to see the existence of the operational guidance. It links closely with the PIM conceptual framework, in particular the PIM principle on data responsibility, protection, and security. And what the operational guidance offers is really a pathway for how to turn this principle into action. What we'll be covering in today's webinar is, after these few words of welcome on my end, is an introduction to the operational guidance and its linkages to PIM. We will then be having a panel exchange between IAM and protection experts, focusing on three particular aspects of the operational guidance, those aspects that pertain to data ecosystem mapping, localization, and how to facilitate joint and consistent approaches for data responsibility at the level of a coordination forum. And then we'll be having time for a bit of Q&A towards the end. So I should point out that it's beyond the scope of what is possible to cover in this webinar to look at the full spectrum of the guidance, of the operational guidance, and that's why we've chosen to zoom in on these three particular topics. To get us started, Rachel Cloutier, who's a data policy officer with UNHCR's Global Data Service and a longtime PIM champion, will be giving us an introduction to the operational guidance as it relates to protection information management and the PIM conceptual framework. And she'll be doing that both in her capacity as a data policy officer, PIM champion, but also in her capacity as having been a member of the Interagency Standing Committee subgroup drafting of the operational guidance, the subgroup under the IASC results group 1 on operational response, which was tasked with drafting the operational guidance. So thank you for being with us today, Rachel, and I pass the mic to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ricky. Can you still hear me loud and clear?
Loud and clear, thank you.
Great. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today with the PIM community once again. As Ricky mentioned, I'll be setting the scene for the panel discussion by presenting an overview of the Interagency Standing Committee's new operational guidance on data responsibility in humanitarian action. As Ricky was saying, this is a bit of a mouthful, so I'll simply be referring to it as the guidance or the operational guidance. Before we go into the details of the guidance itself, we thought it would be useful, as is typical in PIM, to start by defining some key terms. So to be able to move forward on data responsibility, the humanitarian community first needed a shared, agreed upon definition of what data responsibility is in the first place. So as you see here, data responsibility is defined as being the safe, ethical, and effective management of personal and non-personal data for operational response in accordance with established frameworks for personal data protection. Then each of these three adjectives are defined, a bit like we did to define PIM as systematic, principled, and collaborative. So here, safety refers to data security, as well as to human rights and other legal obligations, all in the spirit of do no harm. Ethical refers to both humanitarian ethics and data ethics, and effective refers to ensuring that our data activities achieve their intended purposes. And I'm sure here that you're already seeing some of the PIM principles come through. So the definition also helps to clarify that data responsibility is about both personal data and non-personal data, while at the same time acknowledging that personal data is to be managed in accordance with established frameworks. It was important, of course, in the definition of data responsibility to preserve the specific realm of rules and laws that regulate the processing of personal data specifically. This gives us a nice opportunity to clarify how data responsibility is linked to data protection and data security, as these are different but related. And the operational guidance also helps us unpack and understand this a little bit. So data protection is inherently about personal data and the rights associated with processing someone's personal data as a data subject. So these rights include the right to information, to access, correct, and delete data, personal data, of course, one's personal data, and to object to the processing itself. And data protection comes with a variety of institutional, technical, and physical safeguards, many of which are mandatory and inscribed in national laws or mandatory organizational policies. Data security is a concept that's applicable to both personal data and non-personal data. It's about the different types of technical and procedural or organizational measures we take to secure data. And by this, we mean to ensure that data is safely stored, that we're able to preserve its confidentiality, to preserve its integrity, and that we can prevent its unauthorized access or accidental loss. So note here that data security is a principle of data protection, since personal data can only be protected if it's also secure. And this is why you see here in the diagram that the data security bubble is touching the data protection bubble. Data security is also a principle of data responsibility, as we'll see in a few moments. As you can imagine, we can't be responsible with data if we're not able to ensure that it's secure. And this is why the data security bubble is within the larger data responsibility one. And here we get to data responsibility, which can therefore be understood as the overarching concept. It encompasses both data security and data protection. It includes both personal data and non-personal data, all the while acknowledging the specific rules and laws that are set for personal data, as we saw earlier in the definition. And then, of course, on the yellow outer layer, we have the highest level with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, within which all our humanitarian action takes place, including on data management. So let's move now to the guidance itself. as Ricky was mentioning, the guidance was endorsed by the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, a few months ago in February. And it's the first system-wide framework for data responsibility in the humanitarian sector. And system-wide means that it's applicable to both UN and non-UN organizations, as it was developed under the auspices of the IASC, which is the highest level humanitarian coordination forum. And the work was launched because there was a belief that this kind of system-wide guidance could help establish a shared understanding of data responsibility, fill gaps in existing guidance, enable collaboration, and increase capacity to actually do data responsibility in the field. And this in turn would help advance the rights of affected populations and contribute to humanitarian outcomes. So just like PIM aims to, quote unquote, enable better protection outcomes, so too does this guidance on data responsibility aim to improve the response. And this is a way of saying that, as always, our work with data and on data related issues is always about the people that we serve. So the guidance was developed last year in 2020 in a 14-month process. The subgroup was created in January, a few months before COVID, under the IASC Results Group 1 on operational response, with the specific task of preparing this guidance. The subgroup itself was co-led by the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, IOM, and UNHCR, and OCHA served as the main secretariat and pen holder. The subgroup was composed of about 20 organizations, as you see here on the slide, a nice mix of NGOs and UN agencies. And preparing the guidance was done through various drafting cycles with the subgroup members, but also a desk review of existing materials. It was, of course, important that the guidance complement and be informed by existing guidance from both the development community and the humanitarian community, including PIM. There was also a public survey, dedicated consultations with the global clusters and the global Information Management Working Group, a field level review, and an open feedback process through which over 250 people from 30 organizations provided inputs. And so a very inclusive and consultative process. So what was the result of those efforts? As you see here, the guidance is organized in 4 sections. The first one sets the scenes and the general parameters. It describes the rationale and approach, as well as the audience and scope, along with an overview of the common challenges and opportunities we face on data responsibility in humanitarian contexts. And these form the basis of the guidance, i.e. we wanted the guidance to address the challenges and leverage the opportunities. The second section presents a set of principles for data responsibility. This is of no surprise to PIM champions, since we know the importance of ensuring that our work with data is principled. The third section describes the key actions for data responsibility, and these actions are organized by 3 levels of response: system-wide, cluster, sector, and organization. And we'll go into the details of that in a little bit. And then finally, in the 4th section, we have the annexes, where we find the definitions, templates and tools to implement the actions, the list of references and resources that were reviewed to inform the guidance, and then finally some background information of the process through which the guidance itself was developed. So let's take a minute to look at the guidance's audience and then the scope. So the target audience is all humanitarian actors in a given response setting, including UN agencies, other international organizations, and international and national NGOs, and others involved in the response. Since this is really about our collective response, there's also an emphasis on coordination structures. such as humanitarian country teams, intersectoral working groups, and information management working groups. A wide range of functions are also targeted. And here we can list, for example, resident coordinators, humanitarian coordinators, cluster leads, and technical staff, including IMOs, statisticians, M&E officers, ICT staff, registration, humanitarian affairs, program staff, and many others. And the message here is that data responsibility requires the buy-in and the participation of everyone, not only data staff. Just like PIM, data responsibility requires collaboration and joint efforts across functions, organizations, and sectors. On the scope of the guidance, in terms of what data are we talking about, the guidance is about what the Humanitarian Data Exchange, HDX, has called humanitarian data, or what's sometimes called operational data, depending on context or operations. So this is, we're talking about data about the context in which the response is taking place, data about the people who are affected by that situation, and data about the response. And of course, this means the actors themselves and their activities. So the guidance does not cover what we might call corporate or back office data, such as data related to the internal financial management of an organization, human resources, supply chain and logistics, etc. Then if we go up one level from the data type to the management of that data, we can say that the guidance is relevant to all steps of data management, from gathering it to storing, cleaning, analyzing, using, maintaining, archiving, and destroying it. As we know from the PIM matrix and the PIM process, these are steps that we take when we establish PIM systems, such as protection needs assessments, population data management, and protection monitoring, for example. So with those few words, we can move into the meat of the substance. The first key component we wanted to share with you today is about the principles for data responsibility in humanitarian action, as you see here on the slide. The subgroup that worked on the guidance did a review of existing principles for data management. Of course, this review included the PIM principles, and I'm sure that you'll recognize them when you look at these 12 principles for data responsibility, that there's a significant amount of overlap. So we have the coordination and collaboration, defined purpose, confidentiality, people-centered and inclusive, and data security. Just like the PIM principles, the goal of these data responsibility principles is to provide a lens to guide humanitarian actors in their decisions about what they do and don't do, with whom, when, and how, and of course the implementation of those decisions. We want to reinforce the commitment to do no harm, so we mitigate the risks while maximizing the benefits of data in humanitarian action, and of course at all steps of data management. And you'll have noticed here that there's a dedicated principle for personal data protection, again to preserve the specificity of considerations related to the processing of personal data. Next, we get to the list of 8 recommended actions for data responsibility. The actions are really how we move from the conceptual part of the guidance to the practical application of what it means to actually, quote unquote, do data responsibility. And these actions include things like a data responsibility diagnostic, a data ecosystem mapping, information sensitivity classifications, data sharing agreements and information sharing protocols, and data incident management. In the guidance, you'll find descriptions of each of these actions, as well as an explanation of why it's important for data responsibility. And the actions are presented in logical sequence to serve as a kind of roadmap for progressive action and improvements on data responsibility. So we start logically with the data responsibility diagnostic, and then we can move on to other things like the ecosystem mapping, impact assessments, et cetera, et cetera. In each context, the actors on the ground will decide where they need to start or what they need to improve, depending on the state of data responsibility in their given context. There's also emphasis placed in the guidance on the need to implement these actions in a way that ensures meaningful engagement with national organizations and authorities as appropriate in the context. And the panelists will be getting into this topic in the context of the discussion. Then the question was, okay, these are the actions, but who actually does this? What does this mean? What does this look like in practice? So the operational guidance takes the 8 actions and describes what they look like more concretely when we implement them at 3 levels of a response: the system-wide level, the cluster sector level, and the organization level. The system level, here we're talking about in a response context, actors such as the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator's office, the humanitarian country team, OCHA, UNHCR in refugee settings, and various coordination structures such as the NGO forum. At level 2 cluster sector, we're talking about the actions that are taken by cluster or sector lead agencies or co-lead agencies in collaboration with the partners. And level 3 is about the individual organizations working in that specific environment. So the guidance describes the actions for each level. For example, it explains what it means and what it looks like to do the action on the data ecosystem mapping for the system-wide level, cluster, and organization level, along with providing information about roles and responsibilities to actually do this. For the organization level, at level 3, as you might see in the screenshot here of the tables, you'll see that there's no information about roles because, of course, the guidance is applicable and relevant to such a great diversity of organizations that it was not really possible or desirable to try to say something very specific about that. So each organization is to decide which teams or functions need to take the actions forward depending on their own institutional settings. So along with the principles that we saw earlier, these tables with the actions for level 1, 2, 3 are really the kind of beating heart of the guidance in terms of the guidance that's provided on data responsibility. Finally, it was important to the subgroup to provide the practical tools to make all of this possible. Many of us will kind of have an intuitive reaction to understand why data responsibility matters to what we do. And they want to do it, but they need some tools. We need some tools to make this happen in practice. So Annex B in the operational guidance is where you'll find the templates for almost all of the actions. Note that the templates are not mandatory and they're not meant to replace any existing guidance or tools. They are examples to help organizations either do all of this for the first time, or also to check if their existing tools and templates are aligned with the best practice in this interagency guidance. I highlighted here the template to the data ecosystem mapping since we'll be discussing it today. The mapping is really an important step to provide an overview of the major data management activities in a given context, the stakeholders who are involved, different data flows, and the platforms in use. And it allows us to identify any data gaps, and very importantly, of course, avoid duplicative data collection, clarify roles and responsibilities, prioritize what it is that we're doing, and make strategic decisions about responsible data management in the response. So all these templates are there and available in Annex B via a live link, and they'll be updated based on feedback received and the lessons learned on their use over time. So please don't hesitate to be in touch. This is an open invitation to be in touch if you have experiences to share as you use these templates in your context. So that's it on my side. I hope the overview of the IASC guidance was helpful to set the scene for the panel discussion on the specific implications and applications to PIM. For any questions on the guidance, you're welcome to contact me or, of course, the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data. And with those few words, over to Rike and panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Rochelle. This was super helpful. And with that, as mentioned by Rochelle, we'll be turning our attention to how we do data responsibility in practice and how we do data responsibility in relation to protection coordination for our activities specifically. And it's with great pleasure that we're joined today by a panel of esteemed colleagues with expertise on protection coordination and information management. With us today, we have Salma Abdillahi, Protection Cluster Co-Lead of Somalia, working for the Danish Refugee Council. Salma has worked in the Eastern Horn of Africa for a number of years, including with the local NGO WACA. We're also joined by Martin Stops, IM officer working on protection, presently working for the whole of Syria Protection Cluster for UNHCR. We're also joined by Elise Veron, who's a UNHCR staff who's been working as Senior Protection Cluster Coordinator, was presently working as Senior Protection Cluster Coordinator in Kabul, Afghanistan. She's been working on the various protection functions with NGOs and UNHCR for over a decade in Eastern Africa, the Middle East, and Southwest Asia. And last but not least, we're also joined by Oliver Ussel, who is an IM officer of serving as a Ukraine data protection focal point with OCHA, who prior to serving in this present function also was working in an IM function in the Myanmar response. These panelists are joining us today to share their reflections on how application of the operational guidance can serve to enable safe, reliable, and meaningful management of protection data, and to discuss how the operational guidance is likely to impact our collective efforts in protection coordination fora. Can I just ask you all, if you wish to show your live faces in the video, then you're most welcome, so we can all see what you look like live. Thank you very much for this. I won't ask you to of the panelists, I won't ask you to overstretch or exhaust your bandwidth, so we'll also be showing live images of you. Hi, nice to see you. Great to have you with us. The operational guidance, turning to how we do data responsibility. The operational guidance recommends that as cluster and protection coordination fora, we create and maintain a data ecosystem map, which was what Rochelle was speaking about, which is essentially this visualization of data flows between stakeholders and listing the data assets which are available within organizations. Similar types of collective registries have already been in use by protection actors, such as the use of assessment registries. But the data ecosystem mapping and the data asset registry proposed by the operational guidance dig a level deeper, as it sets out to provide a summary not only of assessments, but of the data assets being generated and how they're being managed and how they flow between actors. The question I'd like to pose to our panel is, for protection actors, how can such data ecosystem mapping bring us closer to evidence-informed action for quality protection outcomes? We'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections.
Hi, Rike. Thanks for the question. I may start actually talking about the Ukrainian context and my role as OCHA. I am head of unit. I've been working in Ukraine for more than a year now, and this is a highly political context for which data is not available as much as we expect, and we have thought many times to launch a data ecosystem mapping, but unfortunately, actually, we haven't been able to do so. But through the IAM working group that I coordinate, we have launched a kind of process which is actually available online now, which is actually listing assessments, having an assessment registry online through our monitoringresponse.info platform, working with clusters to make sure that everybody's on the same page on the data flows and what data is available. I think when that data is available is the beginning of the story. In most of humanitarian context, I'm not sure that all clusters, protection actors are always aware of what data is available, or what can be used publicly, what data is highly confidential, and what are the data gaps. So I think starting with having a data ecosystem mapping for context where a lot of data is available, or starting maybe with an assessment registry, working through fora like an IAM working group is a very good start to map again what is available, what are the gaps, and help decisions to be made on what data can be used and what data should be kept internal, confidential, or even removed in line with the do not harm policy, for example, and other possible issues related to a specific context. So over to my colleagues from the panel to share the inputs on other context.
Yeah, thanks, Olivier. And yeah, we share exact same experience in Somalia when it comes to the importance of mapping the ecosystem that you currently have to also inform the programming. So the example I'll share just to answer the question will be based on the SPMS, and the SPMS stands for the Somalia Protection Monitoring Tool. This is a non-incident based tool we currently have in Somalia, and we use it to actually collect and analyze information in order to identify the trends and patterns of violations of rights, as well as protection risks affecting the communities that we are working with. The purpose for this now is based on the findings to actually, so that those findings can inform effective programming as well as advocacy. When it comes to how we actually did the data ecosystem mapping, when the SPMS was being developed, we did follow the PIM process was followed in assessing the information landscape. And this, of course, is looking at the defined purpose as well as the information needs. So looking at the data managed by other tools, for example, the MRM, the PRMN, the CPIMS, as well as the GBBIMS in the country, and looking at how a tool like the SPMS, which again is a non-incident based tool, can cover the protection data gaps without the risk of causing any further harm within the community. So it really did help us in terms of by mapping and sharing those information with each other, we can actually start to identify those common areas that we have interest in, and potentially also develop those synergies in terms of also widening those evidence bases on which is based on our programmings. So that is the current experience we do have in Somalia in terms of also doing the data ecosystem mapping.
Hi, this is Martin with very many thanks to Salma for some very good points and Olivier. And thank you to Rika and Rachel for the introduction. I just thought I'd just make a couple of points on this sort of starting point on the data ecosystem mapping, which of course is not something new or an additional burden that's being introduced by the responsibility guidance. This is something that all of us as PIM champions and good information management practitioners should be doing, which is basically ensuring that if there are data sources available, or if we are aware of them, the fact of their existence should be public, which is in fact the starting point for everything else. Once let's say the listing of the sources is done, whether there are, let's say, formal data sensitivity classification documents or data sharing rules already in place, we at least have a checklist that we can refer to figure out whether the data is available to us, or for example, if we are the producers of that data, how and when we can share it with others. So the first thing is that the key point is this is not something new. I think the operational guidance is very useful in that it helps us sort of put together a checklist of things we need to do to ensure that data is shareable. I think many of us will recognize in the sort of protection context that the typical answer to the question when you're talking to somebody informally about data sharing, or especially when it comes to raw data, if you ask child protection, can you share this data set? The answer, typically the default, is no. The reason being that the sensitivity of the data potentially breaks the do no harm principle. But once you force yourself to go through the sensitivity classification, then it basically opens up existing data sets, provided you know they exist. And it opens it up for greater use and secondary use in order to understand the protection context. I didn't have this in my original notes, but this morning I was reviewing in the Syria context, which is quite complex, where the response is managed through 3 quite distinct hubs who have quite specific data protection parameters in terms of the response. For example, within the hubs for response in Syria, the hubs, or even at the whole of Syria level, the names of partners even who implement the protection response are not shared between the hubs or at the whole of Syria level due to the sensitivity of the context. But one thing I think, just in terms of a practical recommendation for implementation, the thing that I'm just reading right now is, for example, instead of looking at it holistically in terms of having a data ecosystem mapping and then ensuring that there's checking all the boxes on the guidance in terms of data sensitivity classification and information sharing, what I'm looking at right now is a document for the multi-sector needs assessment, which is an addendum, basically a description of the data set, what is being sort of coordinated by OCHA, and it runs through each of the elements of the data responsibility guidance in terms of sensitivity of the data, whether aggregated at geographical, household, or whatever level, and basically I think this, I'll see if I can share this in the group a little bit later, but adding this data responsibility addendum to each data set, I think, is a very good practical step to help us all understand and implement the guidance, which ultimately is focused on delivering a better protection response. I'll hand it back to colleagues now and happy to take any questions. Over.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for sharing your thoughts. We have a couple of additional questions ahead of us, and so I think to move forward, we'll focus on the additional topics and then take questions afterwards. The second topic for exploration, or on which we would like to hear your thoughts, relates to the operational guidance. Its call for collaboration. The operational guidance calls for collaboration, and it also points to underrepresentation of local organizations and civil society organizations and community-based structures in data management activities. And it points to this as a common challenge for data responsibility in humanitarian action. I think many of us have seen how local organizations and community-based structures are commonly seen playing a role in relation to data collection and serving as informants. But if we want to look at the full spectrum of data management activities as we move forward on responsible data management as a community, how can we ensure that we as protection actors, how can we ensure that our efforts are inclusive of local actors and community-based structures? It'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks a lot, Ricky. This is Elise speaking. I think the guidance here picks up on a topic that we've all been sensitized on the past couple of years, which is localization, and basically how local actors can be further engaged, further involved in leading coordination structure, leading the delivery of services, etc. Well, some efforts remain needed in the aid sector to build the capacity of national stakeholders and provide for them the necessary support for their development and their growth. And I'll take here the example of protection monitoring in Afghanistan, which is led by the protection cluster, and to show how international partners can support the capacity building of national actors. So in Afghanistan, protection monitoring is conducted by 6 partners, 2 UN agencies, and 4 international NGOs. So we clearly see here the lack of representation from local actors, as you've just mentioned. So protection monitoring, for example, could be used as an opportunity for interested national NGOs to shadow larger and international organizations and develop their own capacity building based on that. That would include data collection, data entry into COBO forms, data analysis, etc. But I also think that protection monitoring could be the opportunity for national NGOs to be supported in their fundraising efforts to receive their own funding, because at the end of the day, even though the data is officially collected by international partners, some of them do resort to subcontracting national partners in conducting the data collection in the field. So I think it's important for the protection cluster to give those national partners the chance to apply for their own funding, and they should be supported in this. Especially in a context like Afghanistan, where I'm sure everybody has seen the incredible advances that the Taliban has made throughout the country in the past few days, and we know that national NGOs tend to have better access, or at least a more facilitated and better negotiated access than international partners. So I think here would be a missed opportunity for the protection cluster not to invest in this further and basically support national partners in their meaningful engagement in all the 8 actions listed in the guidance. Funding them through protection monitoring could be one example for them to develop their data management skills and for them to grow further, to be fully included in core protection activities conducted by protection cluster partners in the field.
Yeah, thanks, Elise, and I completely agree with the sentiments you've just shared. But just to also, in response to the question on how to actually ensure meaningful partnerships with the local partners in that management, I'll just share maybe key lessons learned and good practices from the SPMS, which of course is the Somalia Protection Monitoring System. So currently the SPMS has a total of 8 partners. So 2 of them are ING NGOs, 5 are national organizations, and 1 is a minority-led NGO. So in terms of how we are ensuring we are meaningfully engaging with them, there is sustainability and transfer of knowledge. We have ensured the process of being part of the SPMS is very simple in time. And when I say this, I mean there is limited bureaucracy, and the application and approval lies with the protection cluster. So we do get national NGOs reaching out to us and requesting to be part of the SPMS team. So once we do share the expression of interest, they share the resources. Now this is both in financial as well as staffing capacity that they have. Another, in terms of just to make everything easier and ensure everyone is on the same platform, is that we do have standardized tools and information sharing protocols. This is from the COBO questionnaire tools to the SOPs to the data sharing protocols, which is informed by the existing DRC data sharing protocol as well as the UNHCR one. The third one that we are also doing here in Somalia is when we want to ensure meaningful engagement, for example, now with the SPMS partners, we hold a monthly meeting, and the purpose of this meeting is just to ensure that we are all on the same page, give the local partners and as well as the INGOs an opportunity to interact with the National Protection Cluster, since we are at that coordination level and ensuring that there is no overlap to support them in any capacity gap they have or resources. And this also includes ensuring they are included in the updating of the tools. So when everything happens, it doesn't stay at the national level. We do actually send these tools to them, requesting for their inputs and feedback and their thoughts. And this is what has been happening with the current ongoing review and evaluation of the SPMS. And this really helps us makes our lives easier in terms of ensuring that we get the buy-in and the trust from the partners. We also at the National Protection Cluster, as well as the DRC Information Management Officer, provide training opportunities. So when we are training the protection monitors, we really don't just box them into just training them on how to use the COBO forms, the data collection, or what data protection protocols are. But in our modules, we actually include other thematic areas like protection against sexual exploitation, disability inclusion, for example, psychological first aid, referral pathways, as well as survivor-centered approach. And now this is tied into my next point in terms of, the flexibility. The PMs have opportunity to work in other programs within their organization, and they're not 100% on the SPMS. So this gives them actually an opportunity to apply what they have learned in other ongoing projects. And like I've said, not boxing them into one area of just collecting the data. So another point is in terms of facilitating access to funding. So as I've mentioned, we do have one minority-led organization. So we've taken the initiative of actually building their capacity and facilitating meetings with donors, because one thing we've noticed in these big forums, local NGOs, especially minority-led organizations, shy away from these big forums in terms of what their challenges are or what kind of support they need. So we actually went ahead as the National Protection Cluster here in Somalia and organized separate meetings for NGOs, so they can have that one-on-one, especially with SHF, in terms of what are the criteria for them to be part of SHF funding. An example, of course, is the minority-led organization called Livelihood Relief and Development Organization, where through the capacity building and because of the advocacy, we actually managed to get SHF to do capacity assessment and include them as one of our SHF partners. And actually starting in September or October, they will be getting funding from SHF and start data collection through the protection monitoring system. So those are just a few examples from Somalia when it comes to inclusion and collaboration.
Thanks, Salma, for these examples. I have from Ukraine an example to share, which is quite recent. Since we have local actors, we rely a lot on local actors, mostly on in the Donbass region on the other side of the contact line that we call the non-government controlled area, and most of the data that we need comes from these local partners, local protection partners on the other side of this contact line. And there are very few who get accreditation to work in this area. So we rely a lot on them, and in the scope of what we call joint operating principles that was established along with the Mediterranean country team at the IAM working group level, and with the help of the Center for Mediterranean Data, we decided to use some of the recommended tools and to shape it in a way that it would help to build trust with these partners and to make sure that data can be shared accordingly, and there is also a good understanding on what we do and what we don't do with the data which is shared by local actors and by all NGOs and organizations who share their information on projects. So this is actually SOPs for a tool called 5W, who does what, where, tracking the response by projects. And this is a common tool that everybody has heard about in any humanitarian context. But in Ukraine, we decided to use this opportunity because it's very central. We don't get so much information on the response, but with the 5W, and we've seen more and more reluctance to share data with a lot of assessments which were changed at the last minute or canceled because of pressure from what we call de facto authorities in this part of eastern Ukraine. So the idea was really to make sure to work, with all clusters, protection cluster, and all implementing partners, making sure that those who participate and report to this tool are aware of what we expect in terms of data, what level of disaggregation, how detailed the data is needed, but also to have an agreement, kind of a bottom-up approach also, feedback from these local actors who can be at risk, to tell what data is really confidential and shouldn't be shared, or what data cannot be shared at all, so that we better understand also how to move forward and how to fill all the data gaps that we observed previously. So we are at the very beginning of this process, but I'm waiting to see the results, and I think good communication and transparency on what final users as cluster coordinators or OCHA do with the data always help to define first data sensitivity and have a proper classification and common ground to know where the data should be published or should be used. So thank you. This is all my example, and I think I went even beyond actually the question, which was more about the involvement of local actors, but I think it was still a good example.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for sharing your insights in relation to how we can ensure inclusive approaches to data responsibility, including concrete examples of how you're doing it already. The last topic for discussion relating to the operational guidance is the operational guidance focus on the operational guidance proposition that we jointly designed for data responsibility, and that we foster use of consistent approaches among diverse members of a protection coordination forum. These are messages which really strongly resonate with the message of the PIM initiative also. The operational guidance recommends as an action for clusters and sectors that they may wish to develop and support the use of common standards and tools for cluster and sector-led data management activities to foster a consistent approach among members. And it also states that the agencies, the lead and co-lead agencies, may want to design cluster-led data management activities, for example, by including data responsibility in cluster strategies. And so these are some concrete recommendations for how we can ensure that data responsibility is placed firmly on the agenda of protection coordination fora. And based on where you're all seated, panelists, I'd also like you to share your reflections on how you think we can ensure that data responsibility is firmly placed on the agenda of protection clusters and working groups. And reflecting back on Rochelle's point, not merely, data protection or data security being on the agenda, but really the holistic data responsibility approach of the operational guidance.
Well, thanks a lot, Ricky, for that. Well, I think unfortunately we're all working in circumstances where everything was due yesterday, everything is always so rushed, and I think many colleagues on the call actually today will recognize themselves in this situation. But the lack of cluster level guidance on data responsibility has actually led to more work for all protection cluster partners. So we're not investing now in defining data responsibility from the cluster and how the cluster would actually save time later by investing in its role to provide data responsibility guidance to its member. So basically, if I wanted to phrase that in other words, what we don't do now because we don't have time to do it actually results in more work down the road and in a missed opportunity to apply the guidance principles more consistently. So I'll choose here again, I'll choose here to focus on the data sharing agreement, which is a recommended action for data responsibility in the guidance. And I'll use again the example of protection monitoring in Afghanistan, since I just introduced it earlier. So we've got 6 organizations partaking, but because of a lack of a data sharing agreement, we are not using a common server on which to enter the collected data on Kobo. So some organizations partaking in protection monitoring use the Kobo form that is hosted by OCHA on the OCHA server, but some of the partners, in the absence of that data sharing agreement, upload their own data onto their own server, and then later on share the data to the protection cluster IMO for data consolidation, cleaning, analysis, etc. So this obviously does not follow the principles described in the guidance. And I'll refer here to, I think, a principle that is extremely important in the guidance, which is coordination and collaboration. The fact that we've got different partners using different servers, some of them having to send the data later on to the protection cluster IMO, defeats the purpose of collaboration, and that goes against the principle mentioned in the guidance clearly. And by this, we also run the risk of having delayed data, incomplete data, which would also delay the preparation of reports. So all in all, this would result in poor collaboration that has to be improved. Another principle I think that is really important for us and to focus on in the very near future in the guidance is data security. So because we've got some partners not using the common server hosted by OCHA, that data is shared with us through emails. But obviously, emails are only so secure, right? Only to a certain extent. And these emails shared specifically with the protection data in it do not have any additional layers of protection in terms of data security. There's no additional password required to access this data. So there's always a risk here. The email could be sent to the wrong person, for instance. I think this has happened to pretty much everybody. Someone who should not be copied has been copied, or someone was, received the email that was not intended for them. And obviously, because here we're talking about sensitive protection data, this could lead to obviously very concerning data leaks. And again, the emphasis here to have a data sharing agreement is key in order for us to really implement the data security principle from the guidance. So I think all in all, the guidance provides us this really important opportunity to make those changes now. Preparing the data sharing agreement should be a first priority. It is recommended as an action for data responsibility, and I think clusters and cluster leads, co-leads have the responsibility to put it on top of the agenda of cluster priorities. I know for the protection cluster in Afghanistan, we are revising our biannual protection cluster strategy towards the end of the year for 2022 and 2023. And I think it will be really important then to take this into consideration and have a firm data responsibility guidance in place to be provided to our cluster members to contribute to the two principles that I just mentioned, but also to others mentioned in the guidance as well.
Hi, it's Martin again. I'll just add one more point. I mean, echoing Elisa's excellent comments, I think absolutely a lack of a well-documented data responsibility framework, in fact, creates more work and creates more barriers to data sharing. And I'll do a little bit of let's say, a sales job on the implementation of the operational guidance. Again, it's not realistically, it's not an additional burden. It's not something invented that we need to do that doesn't have concrete benefits. The key is to have data sensitivity classification and data sharing rules in place system-wide, but also for each individual set of data that is being produced, which allows for a much more streamlined ability to share data, which ultimately leads to a better protection response. And in Syria right now, we're in the process of, I mean, both at the system-wide level led by OCHA and within the protection sector across the 3 hubs, we're realistically only in the beginning of the process of updating some guidelines that were developed in 2017, 2018, but realistically, we're trying to recreate things from scratch. This is a much bigger effort than simply updating a framework that has been developed. And I would strongly recommend that either at protection sector or cluster working group level, you have a twice yearly agenda item, a standing agenda item on the working group agenda, which is basically what is the status of the data responsibility review, have all the information sharing agreements being reviewed recently, and then basically updating it, let's say twice a year or more often as new data sets are being produced, is simply let's say it's a one-day process as opposed to a sort of 2 or 3 week process of emails going backwards and forwards across multiple partners. Okay, thank you. I'll hand it back to Rika or Rachel. Over.
Thank you very much, Elise and Martin, for sharing your very concrete recommendations in terms of how we can take this forward. We have 10 minutes left of this webinar, and with that, I'd like to thank you panelists for your contributions. I'm sure that the topics which you've discussed also have sparked reflections among participants. So what I'd like to do now is to welcome reflections and questions from the webinar participants, specifically on the topics addressed in the panel exchange, or if you have questions about the operational guidance more broadly, Rachel is also with us to answer questions. You can feel free to either type your questions in the chat or to simply unmute yourselves and share your questions or reflections. The floor is open. There was a question posted in the chat previously from Naren, who was asking when the topic of localization was being discussed, if there are particular suggestions that the panelists can give when it comes to working with government as a local actor. And I don't know whether any of you have particular thoughts on that.
Okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Martin.
No, I insist you go ahead. I only had a slight referential comment. Go ahead, Salma. Over.
Thank you, Martin. I'm just also trying to, if I got the question right in terms of engagement with the government. So when of course, when the SPMS was being developed, one of the key stakeholders that was involved in the development was the government, and this was done throughout the process. The other thing that we've made sure in terms of ensuring that the engagement and collaboration just doesn't stop at the initial phases, in the Somalia Protection Monitoring System, on a quarterly basis, we do have something called Joint Analysis Workshop, and this is also an avenue where we ensure to engage with the government so they can also see the findings that are coming out of the SPMS. For example, in most cases, they are related to issues around access to justice. So having them in the room or online workshop helps, just keeping them updated and informed in terms of how everything's going. So the other thing what we also did when we were reviewing or evaluating, we actually made sure they also were part of as part of the key informants, so that they know that the tool they helped launch, how it's going, if those objectives that were met have been, achieved, and the support also as the government, what kind of support they can give us. And we have been having, just last week, we met with the Ministry of Women, and I'm hoping those further, COVID has complicated everything for us, but now we are going back to physical meetings, but I'm hoping those recurring meetings will also put, bring back our relationship back on track. But those are just a few things that we have done for the SPMS in particular. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Salma. I'll just add a slightly different point, and I'll be brief. I think there's a great benefit in having your existing rules and your framework well documented beforehand, where you are contemplating how you're sharing your information between parts of the sector or the cluster and partners and potentially government, so that when you do in fact end up in perhaps a meeting with government representatives and they are saying, we need X, Y, and Z, which is perhaps going to be more sensitive, you refer them to a standard document that already exists, that's already been agreed and is in line with IASC guidance and accepted by the international community. And you have a great deal more weight when it comes to perhaps you're saying, no, we can't share that data because it would break rules X, Y, and Z as part of the overall framework. But if you're trying to sort of invent things on the fly in a meeting with government representatives, potentially you may end up in greater difficulties. Over, back to you, Rika.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Naren, did this answer your question, or do you have additional comments from your end to add? If not, then another question has been posted in the chat, which was whether panelists have any suggestions and tips for how to train staff on data responsibility. Is that something you worked with? Do you have any recommendations to share on training of staff on data responsibility and the operational guidance?
Hi, it's Martin again. I'll dive in here, but with a very quick comment, which is literally I am putting together some training materials for a sort of workshop for IM and protection across the Syria, the whole of Syria protection sector. Without the framework and these super useful tools in the guidance, I guess it would be taking me weeks to develop this, as opposed to kind of topping and tailing the existing presentations. So I think the first step is to get the awareness out there And secondly, really promote it as a tool that actually saves time and effort. And then I think the rest takes care of itself. Certainly, I'll be sharing with Rochelle and Rika the sort of perhaps our localized training materials in terms of the sector from Syria, and I would certainly recommend that other operations would do the same. Over.
Thank you, Martin, and thanks for championing the guidance and also being clear that indeed it doesn't necessarily set out anything that's new, but rather aims to clarify and support organizations in doing these kind of fundamental things that should already be done. Just a quick thought here, and agreeing with you that really the first step is awareness. And so the Data Responsibility Working Group, the DRWG, which Enrique will mention as we close, has been established a few months ago to continue the work on data responsibility in the interim period between the launch of the guidance and the review of the guidance in a couple of years. Like we want to keep data responsibility on the agenda and continue to learn collectively. And as part of the work of the Data Responsibility Working Group, one of the things that we're doing is information sessions, which speaks to Martin's point about awareness raising. So if you have a need or a desire to have information sessions on the IASC operational guidance, it's something that could be organized and supported by the Data Responsibility Working Group. We do try to kind of maximize our outreach in these kinds of things. So we would, for example, go through a global cluster or an HQ entity or a regional office in order for the briefing to really reach as many people as possible in relationship to either a region or a context. So you're very welcome to be in touch, and we could see if the DRWG could support on that. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Rochelle and Martin, for your kind offers of support to colleagues. With that, I will proceed to just share some closing thoughts and recommendations for the participants who've been with us today, and also big thank you to you panelists and Rochelle for the presentation. It's been wonderful to hear your thoughts in terms of the practical implications of the operational guidance on our work as protection actors. For the approximately 70 participants who've been with us for the webinar today, I'd like to conclude by just letting you know where you can find more information and how you can engage further on data responsibility. Because as Rochelle said, just like PIM, data responsibility requires collaboration across functions and organizations and sectors. And there is plenty of opportunity for you to explore the operational guidance with colleagues in your respective organizations, but also beyond. There is a standing invitation for you to join the Data Responsibility Working Group on behalf of your organization, and you can see here the contact email of the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, who you can be in touch with if you wish to discuss further beyond within your respective organizations. You can also find more information on protection information management, the operational guidance, and the working group through these links. With this, and a warm word of encouragement to review the operational guidance and to discuss it with your colleagues, not only your protection colleagues or your IAM colleagues, but really to have a shared dialogue across functions about your shared responsibility when it comes to data responsibility. And a warm recommendation to reflect on how your organization, your coordination forum can work with the operational guidance, not as an additional burden or an additional layer, but really as some of the panelists said, as a collective basis for action and as a tool that can really save time and efforts and serve as a common basis for us to jointly ensure data responsibility in our ambitions to ensure that we have an evidence-based response to protection concerns. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope that you've enjoyed this webinar, A recording of this webinar will be made available to everyone who registered and also made available on the www.pim.guide homepage. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. Once again, many thanks to the panelists and to the presenter for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.